Gracias. Thank you for having me here today. I will speak in English because it's easier to not mix up with Portuguese. But I'll be glad to be answering the questions in English, but we'll be speaking in Spanish. And thank you so much. The work that I will be presenting today is part, of course, of the work that I have been doing for a while right now. And it's also part of a new article that I have been working on this idea of new memorials that are emerging and memorials that emphasize a new sort of instrument that are this wall of names that has been present in different kinds of other initiatives, but is now becoming also present in the monuments and memorials honoring then the victims of the Atlantic slave trade. Then for many years, we can say that this tragic history of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery remained concealed in the public space, from the public space of former slave societies, and also societies that heavily relied on the slavery. But in the last 3 decades, as you know, and this is why we are having this presentation, we see an increasing number of organized groups, especially, and social actors as well, who engage themselves in activities to commemorate the victims of these human atrocities. Then this presentation then will examine this device that is called Wall of Names and how they have been used in memorials commemorating the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. While I situate this trend in the international context, I explore also how slavery has been commemorated in the United States over the last 3 decades. Then I rely here much on the notion of multidirectional memory that was put by a scholar of the Holocaust, Michael Rothbard, to underscore indeed how the Holocaust and other genocides have played a central role then in shaping the memorialization of Atlantic slavery, especially then through the creation of this wall of names. Then basically the kind of work that I do in terms of interpreting this kind of memorial is based then, of course, on the analysis of the devices themselves, but also on the views of the activists, the curators, the government officials, and by engaging with this, what these social actors they say about this kind of device, I seek to understand then how this specific kind of memorial has been claimed as the most legitimate and engaging way to honor the victims of slavery. And this is something relatively new when talking about slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. You are going to see during the presentation that the wall of names has been present for a very long period, especially during the 20th century. But it's something new that we are using this kind of device to commemorate the victims of slavery. One element that you certainly are aware is that since the 18th century, in the United States, we saw then really the emergence of these black slave narratives as a literary genre. And in 1935, you are going to have then here in US, during the Great Depression, as part of the New Deal, you are going to have then the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who launched the project, the Federal Writers Project, an initiative then to collect, then to fund written works and supporting at the time people who didn't have, writers who didn't have jobs. And from 1936 to 1938, these men and women were employed in this project and were assigned then to interview former slaves in 17 southern states of the country. But despite the biases of these interviewers at the time, this ambitious project had, and it was also a very original initiative that we didn't see in any other country in the Americas, really provided some clues to understand the experiences of former slaves in the United States. There is a lot of work done on that, on these narratives, and the point of bringing this here, you are going to see later, is that these became important sources despite the fact that they carry some biases. Then on the eve of the Second World War, then slavery, of course, became the object of many representations in U.S. popular culture as well. Then you are going to have these representations embodying then elements of the collective memory of slavery, usually carried out by white descendants of slave owners. You are going to see then novels and movies such as Gone with the Wind that convey this nostalgic image of the old slave-holding South, often reinforcing then these depictions of enslaved men and women as submissive subjects. Yet with the rise of the civil rights movement, then starting in the 1950s, you're going to see African-American activists here in U.S., writers, artists, and other social actors as well. We started challenging these representations of passive slaves. And one of the most, perhaps, successful examples of this transformation is the novel by Alex Haley that is called The Roots. And this novel, of course, was adapted to television and became well known around the world, and then not only in the United States, in the rest of the Americas. It was, of course, broadcast in Europe and even in Africa as well. And both the book, indeed, and the television series, they promoted and new African-American representations of enslaved men and women that emphasized much more resistance and resilience. Then if you can put the first slide, please. Yes. Then you see here that except for countries in the Caribbean and Latin America, here I talk about of course, Cuba, Jamaica, Colombia, Brazil, even Mexico, except for these countries where we had then a number of memorials and monuments that paid homage then to slave rebels. The work of enslaved men and women was rarely recognized in heritage sites of former plantations or urban settings where slavery existed. And this kind of image that we're seeing here, then in Cartagena, of this monument, then celebrating one slave rebel, is almost inexistent in a country such as the United States. But the end of the Cold War propelled then a new visibility of historically excluded groups, we can say, who started indeed asserting their identities, encouraging then international exchanges and increasing also global connections among Black organizations and populations of African descent in general. Then these Black social actors and activists gradually occupied the public space to claim the history then of slaves who resisted slavery. And here I am emphasizing the social actors because all these monuments, they are built and they are placed within certain communities, and they don't emerge from nothing. They are totally related to the demands of the social actors. And you can put the next slide that shows indeed one of these monuments that indeed is recent because it's from about 10 years ago, celebrating then Zumbi of Palmares in Brazil, which is then the leader of the largest runaway slave community in Brazil. And historians also began paying more attention to individual trajectories of enslaved people who coped indeed with the hardships of slavery by emancipating themselves or also by negotiating then better work and living conditions. And very often historians relied then on these first-hand narratives and testimonies to give a more central place then to the lived experiences of the enslaved. And this phenomenon indeed did not occur in isolation. Then before indeed the end of the Second World War, we are going to see initiatives memorializing the Holocaust. Then this started already during the Second World War, especially through the publication of testimonies of victims of the Holocaust. And then through these, historians also, they started embracing these individual stories. And since then, these stories have been depicted then in novels, in films, exhibitions, memorials as well. And usually featuring then social actors who resisted the Nazi regime. If you can put the next slide, please. Then during the 1990s, you are going to see then heritage sites of old plantations in the United States, giving more visibility to the institution of slavery. Then this is a dimension that was relatively new because it was totally evacuated from these places that were rather designed, as you see here, then to feature the mansions where these slaveholders then lived. And usually people, as you can see in this image, this is the Monticello, that is the home of Thomas Jefferson, and features then most of the visitors who visit the plantation. They are not there to know about the slavery, but they are there to know about the sophisticated life of Thomas Jefferson, about himself, about his life, and not about the more than 300 enslaved people who lived in this site. Now, despite then, if you can put the next slide, please. Still, we can say that despite these older, very timid attempts and more recent robust attempts, let's say that way, to feature slavery in former slavery plantation sites, slaves remain portrayed in most of the sites as nameless individuals. We have several of these plantations, as you see here in this picture. That is Montpelier, that is the plantation of James Madison here in Virginia in the US. And we have these cemeteries, of course, where enslaved people, we know that they are buried in these places, but they remain unnamed. Then we don't have any monuments or graves that are honoring individual enslaved people. And even if the visitors to richer plantations, as the ones that you are seeing on the slides, such as then Monticello and Montpelier, which over then the last few years have made several efforts to interpret slavery, even if these places they have underscored how then the history of slavery has been evacuated, then they have recognized that. But it's still, even in these sites where they are bringing again slavery and making it visible to the visitors, even in these places, they continue to perpetuating in many ways the dehumanization and the invisibility of enslaved men and women. Usually the places where the dead are put to rest, such as churchyards, cemeteries, and tombstones, constitute then exemplary sites of memory and commemoration, which are designed to permanently remember the deceased. And this is for the white individuals who lived in these plantations, but enslaved people usually they have remained out of this kind of space, and they remain unnamed. And then if you try to revisit the history of these sites where we can find the names of deceased individuals, we know that with the emergence then of written systems among different societies, you are going to have the introduction then of adding names to these tombstones. And this is a practice that dates from already the ancient times. Then these inscriptions, indeed, they kept the dead as a permanent part of the world of the living, reflecting then the desire of giving them humanity and immortality. In ancient Greece, for example, listing names of war victims, for example, in poems, in monuments, in tombstones, was intended indeed to pay homage to those who died in battle. And if we fast forward after the Second World War, we are going to see a great number of heritage sites, memorials, and museums, especially those associated with the Holocaust, the apartheid in South Africa, and also the Vietnam War, that included a wall of names listing the victims of these atrocities. For example, you can move to the next one. In 1957, then this following then more than a decade after the end of the Second World War, Israel opened the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And this was an initiative labeled as the first official memorial complex, because it's not it's a memorial. We have there is a museum, there is a library, visitor center, several monuments as well. And this was then the first memorial complex designed then to commemorate the martyrs of the Holocaust and the Second World War. And martyrs is the term that is used, not victims. And the term Yad Vashem is taken then from the Bible, from the book of Isaiah, and means then carries this idea of a monument and a name. Then in its literal translation from Hebrew. And it evokes then this practice of naming as the best way to perpetuate the memory of the Holocaust victims. Then since its inception, the Yad Vashem then launched a project that is Pages of Testimony. And these are one-page forms that allow then people to submit names and biographical information of Holocaust victims. And in 1968, then the Yad Vashem created this names room that started then storing then 800,000 names and testimonies organized in alphabetical order. Then it was a sort of archive. And then a decade later, the Yad Vashem dedicated then a memorial, a building, then that is called the Hall of Names, then featuring then the names of nearly 1 million individuals who were victims of the Holocaust in the following years. You are going to see also in the following years then several other names that were added to the database. And today, the Yad Vashem occupies then a very big area, including then museums, memorials, and so on. And there was a major renovation in 2005 and the Hall of Names that we have today at the Yad Vashem is the one that you are seeing in the picture. And entering the memorial, then the visitors reach this sort of circular ramp, as you can see here. There is the ceiling in this conic form, and also a conic structure also underneath the ramp. And along the walls of this ceiling, we have then the pictures and also photographs extracted from the project Pages of Testimony. And the space below the ramp also have then is carved. It's a sort of mirror of this structure that we see in the ceiling. But the outer walls of the memorial that you can see here, then outside the ramp, they have then the physical archive with the names of the victims. And I think that you can move to the next one. And this then drawing then from the ancient practice of listing names on memorial then on tombstones, the Yad Vashem then introduces at least two new dimensions here to the conventional wall of names. First of all, it humanizes the victims of the Holocaust not only by giving them a name, but also making them visible through portraits. They have a name and they have a face. The memorial also complexifies and expands then the notion of wall of names by offering the visitors a physical repository of biographical information, as well as digital archive accessible via the online database that we can have access through our computers, but visitors, they can go to another room and have access to the database. Then here we rely on this old practice of naming people to memorialize the dead, to remember the dead, but we have image and we have also the physical archive that indeed is part of these memorials. Then the creation then of Yad Vashem usually is not necessarily at all then connected to to the monuments regarding Atlantic slave trade and slavery and to the idea of wall of names, because of course it's a destination that perhaps is not as popular, but it's really one of the first memorials to bring this idea in a modern way. Then the creation then of the Yad Vashem Hall of Names certainly expired then the emergence of other memorials, remembering the victims of human atrocities. Unveiled then in Europe, in Africa, in the Americas, you are going to see a growing number of commemoration activities that embrace this kind of device that you are seeing here to a bigger or to a lesser extent. And if you can move to the next slide, please. And among the most iconic of these memorials is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that was unveiled in 1982 here in Washington, D.C. And this was created by a group of veterans of the Vietnam War. And this memorial is at the National Mall, as you can see. Then I don't need to describe much. You have this structure that enters the earth. And you have then this big wall with this V form. And if you can move to the next one, the next slide, you see then that these granite walls have engraved then the names of all those who are considered dead, who were killed or who disappeared then during the war. And if you can see here, in contrast, then with the Yad Vashem Hall of Names, this memorial indeed embraces a more conventional approach of commemoration. Its location, of course, is at the National Mall, where many other monuments and memorials celebrating wars and presidents are present. But and because it is there at the National Mall, it gives to it then the highest how can I say, distinction. But likewise, there are elements also that however, in this memorial that are different from the previous memorials that we can see, including the one that you are seeing at the image, then at the backdrop, that you see the Washington Monument. That usually we have these monuments that are vertical monuments, this one is among the only ones who is really horizontal. And its black color also contrasts with most of the monuments that are usually use white stone. Here, the visitors, they still can, however, engage with the memorial by leaving then messages, flowers, and so on. And also, of course, when they look at the names that are along the memorial, they can see usually their own image reflected on the wall. But you are going to see then over the 20th century, then many other citizens, organizations, governments sponsoring then similar kinds of memorials, paying homage then to victims of atrocities that incorporated the same idea of wall of names, including, for example, and this is not only a Western phenomenon, you are going to have similar initiatives in Latin America. I will not bring this example here, but for example, in Argentina, to the victims of the dictatorship, you are going to have then over the last 15 years a memorial of this same kind unveiled. You are going to see in South Africa as well. If you can move to the next slide. Then this is a memorial, then it's a wall of names that we have in the Apartheid Museum. Then you have this big one, and there is another one, if you can move to the next slide. Then another wall of names, then naming all those who were executed then during the period of the apartheid for political reasons. Another slide, please. Then this also very similar in terms of color and format to the one that we have here in Washington, D.C. This is in Kigali, then in Rwanda. And this was then a memorial to the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And this is a memorial that was unveiled recently, then in 2004. Also, if you can move to the next one, we have another similar memorial in Pretoria in South Africa, unveiled also in 2007, then, which means about 10 years ago, also including then the circular structure with then the names of those who were killed during the apartheid, but also during the process of colonization of South Africa. And here we see that there are spaces, there are blank spaces with no names, and these spaces are left that way on purpose because they are intended to keep open for new names to be added. You have also, if you can move to the next one, then other memorials. Then this is Srebrenica Potokari Memorial. Then this is a memorial honoring then the Bosnian Muslims massacre during the Bosnian War. And this was unveiled in 2010. And if you move to the next one, you are going to see that France also adhered to this idea of wall of names. Here in a memorial that was unveiled in 2005, then there is the Shoah Memorial in Paris. And this is a memorial then that also lists all the 76,000 names of victims of the Holocaust that were deported from France during the Second World War. In addition to that, next one, we have outside, if you can move to the next, yes, outside the memorial, you have also an entire alley, then the Allée des Justes, naming also all those who helped to rescue Jews in France during the Holocaust. But we can say that more recently, the United States championed these initiatives in terms of creating wall of names. If you can move to the next one, you have, especially after September 11, 2001, three important memorials that carry this idea of wall of names. This one is the Pentagon Memorial that is just here nearby where I live. And here, instead of having a wall, we have one bench representing each victim, and each of these benches have the name of the victim imprinted. There is also underneath these benches a pool with water, and this pool is always with the water inside moving. If you can move to the next one. The new memorial then, the memorial that was unveiled where the World Trade Center was located in 2011. This was dedicated. And again, here, we do not have the traditional wall of names, but we have these big pools that are placed exactly at the place where the towers were. And the wall of names appears through these plaques that are at the edges of the pool. Then the name of this memorial is called Reflecting Absence. And we have another, a third memorial to the victims of these attacks that is in Pennsylvania, that has also a wall of names. Then, as put by then scholar Erica Dawes in her book Memorial Mania, naming then became a major trend in memorials unveiled during the second half of the 20th century. Although then widely recognized as the best way to confer victims with the humanity is stripped out from them. In the context of the Atlantic slave trade, naming is a tricky practice. It's a dehumanizing practice. And this is where naming and using wall of names in monuments and memorials to the Atlantic slave trade becomes a more complex practice. Slave merchants, for example, and slave owners, they took out the original names of African-born enslaved individuals by imposing on them new Christian names. Likewise, the practice of recording names of the slaves reinforced dehumanization. Slaves were listed in ship manifests and farm books as ordinary commodities, and very often they carry the same names. Then you are going to have a name such as, if I say in Portuguese, a name, or in Spanish, Maria, and there will be thousands, or then dozens of Marias, not necessarily. Then here, naming is not something that necessarily gives humanity, because these men and women, they are just listed as commodities in a repetitive way. Then many times also written records show nameless individuals, enslaved individuals, only identified by their physical characteristics. Yet, we can say that we have other records where lists of enslaved men and women and children appear and give a more humanizing dimension. For example, in baptism records, for example, death records, very often we have more than just the first name. But despite then the problems associated with naming, the establishment of wall of names as commemorative devices that carry then a sacred dimension emerged as a response to social actors who demanded to make slavery and their enslaved ancestors visible in the public space. Then problematizing then this long-lasting practice that we have then in historical narratives in which slaves have been portrayed as nameless individuals, nameless victims. Public historians, curators, designers, heritage site managers, docents, guides, they labor then to acknowledge the presence of slavery and to emphasize the humanity of enslaved individuals. They are forced to do that through the demand of social actors and in attempts then to perpetuate their memory. Then you are going to see among the initiatives that started this practice, United Kingdom was one of the first countries then to have engaged then with its slave trading past. Then the economic prosperity of Britain, as we know, is associated then with the wealth produced by the work of enslaved men, women, and children, especially in the West Indies. And since, especially during the 1990s, when the public memory of slavery then started resurfacing in societies then involved in the Atlantic slave trade, we're going to see Black activists pressuring then the city council of the city of Bristol, that was one of the three most important slave ports in Britain, to put in place initiatives then acknowledging the city's involvement in the human trade. In 1997 then, and if you can move to the next slide, you are going to have the George House Museum, that is the home of a slave merchant and a planter. And this George House Museum occupies then is located in his old residence. And this merchant is called John Pinney. And in one of the rooms of this house, where people usually would go to see how rich and how important this merchant was, now they can see in a small room a section that is a small section especially dedicated to slavery. This exhibition was updated in 2018, and you are going to see this big panel, horizontal panel, displaying texts and images that narrate Pinney's involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. And then if you look at the next slide, you are going to see that almost unnoticed in one corner of a room, we have then a list of enslaved people who worked in Pinney's estate in the West Indies. Then intended then to this kind of panel is intended to acknowledge the crucial role of slavery and in building then Pinney's wealth, but it still is decontextualized because this list of names is rather an inventory of first names and unnamed individuals that we can hardly claim that this is a device that is honoring the enslaved men, women, and children who worked for Pinney. If you can move to the next one, we also have in the United States other heritage sites created that also created similar rooms to honor the enslaved people who lived and worked in their premises. This that you are seeing here is the Hoyle House and the slave quarters in Medford, Massachusetts. This is one of these initiatives. And this is a National Historic Landmark that was transformed into a museum. This mansion is the only surviving structure comprising then an adjacent slave quarter, urban slave quarters that survived in the north of the United States. And this property was part of a farm that was owned by a man called Isaac Royal, that was a British planter who established himself in Antigua in the West Indies and who moved to the United States in 1737. Bringing with them at the time then his 27 slaves that he brought to this house. And then his son inherited his slaves and so on. And if you can move to the next one, then inside the mansion, we have one entire room dedicated to one of his slaves that is called Belinda. And you also have the old slave quarters where we have the entire list of people who lived in that and worked in that mansion. Then the then enslaved men, women, and children who lived in the property. Belinda is particularly important, and most of the interpretation of this place is around her, because she is known as one of the first former enslaved women who requested reparations to her master through the form of a pension, indeed. And then we have other places as well that use the same strategy of putting together this wall of names. Here, what we have is rather a panel of names. And if we can move to the next one, this is Cape Town. Then the Ezekiel Slave Lodge Museum. This is not a museum that is associated with the Atlantic slave trade, but it's associated then South Africa, Cape Town indeed was not part of the Atlantic slave trade, but there was a slavery, and this was the a building where the museum is, where slaves were kept. But there were connections still between this trade and the Atlantic slave trade. Even, okay, sorry that I have this timer here to just to remind me about the time. But this the Cape Town presence then and involvement in the Atlantic slave trade is not a direct involvement, but it was I stopped that served, for example, to slave merchants who were coming from Mozambique and so on, to stop there before continuing their trip. And this is a building that lodged then the enslaved men, women, and children owned by the Dutch East India Company. And the museum was renovated recently, and in 2006, they unveiled then an exhibition emphasizing the role of slavery in Cape Town, and they created this column of names, column of memory that shows then the names of all enslaved men, women, and children who are held in this building that now is a museum. There are also other structures outside this museum that also have names of those who are enslaved in the slave lodge building. If you can move now then to the next one, and then we can see perhaps the most interesting case regarding these initiatives of utilizing then this wall of names. Here in US, in Louisiana, there is the Whitney Plantation Museum. Then this is a museum that was unveiled then in 2014, then just not even 5 years ago. It's located near New Orleans in Louisiana, and you've certainly heard about it because when it was unveiled, there was a lot of articles published everywhere then in different languages. This was a plantation of the 18th century that was originally owned by a German. And after then the Civil War, the plantation passed to another family and was renamed Whitney. In 1999, then one rich lawyer and real estate, entrepreneur of Louisiana bought this plantation as a way of having to diversify his investments. And once he bought the plantation, he started seeing about the history of the place, and then decided that perhaps it was time instead of using this as an investment, then to create a slavery museum. Then the place opened in 2014, which means 5 years after he purchased the place. And it comprises several structures that are original, such as the mansion that you see, and other structures that were built afterwards in order to create the entire, to create the museum, as they call. Like other southern plantations, of course, this plantation targets the white tourists, who are most of them who visit these places. But of course, with its popularity, it's really attracting much more African Americans and international visitors as well. Contrasting then with the similar kind of sites that we see in the South that glorify the lives of the planters and how wealthy they were, how beautiful their wives were, how rich their furniture, their clothing were. The plantation here seeks really to present slavery from the point of view of enslaved children, who in this context, they become then the special carriers of cultural memory of slavery. And to achieve this goal, what Cummings did, and this is where we come back to the beginning of the presentation about the slave narratives. he decided, he and his director of research and his team, they decided that the way of doing that was to use those narratives of the 1930s that were collected in the 1930s, even if the narratives were not provided by enslaved people who lived in this plantation. And the element with these narratives of the 1930s is that people in the 1930s, they were given these testimonies, but they were children at the time they lived in slavery. Then all the idea of the plantation is to give the view of enslaved children. Then when you arrive at the plantation, visitors, they are assigned then a name and a card displaying the name of one of those enslaved individuals who gave those testimonies in the 1930s. And this kind of approach is believed that will create a sort of empathy between the visitor and between the suffering of the enslaved people and these visitors, who are usually people who are whites, in many cases, who are Southerners, who still preserve racist views and white supremacist views. And this is the belief that the owner of this place he has. If you can move to the next slide. Then these are the children that are these life-size clay statues that are displayed all over the plantation. And the card that you see carry the names. You see that there is a last name on the card, which means that enslaved people didn't have last names. They got these last names once they became freed. Then these are the names of those freed men and freed women who gave those testimonies in the 1930s. And we assume, of course, that those testimonies are their recollections from the period when they were enslaved, but they were still children. And if you can move to the next one, the first memorial, then there are indeed 3 memorials in this property that feature wall of names. It's really the chosen format to honor enslaved men, women, and children. The first memorial then is called Wall of Honor, and we have then this wall with 2 sides. And we have then the name of 350 enslaved men, women, and children who worked in the plantation. One side of the wall have those who were African-born individuals. The other side of the wall has names of those who were born in the United States and who were in many ways then victims of the domestic slave trade. Both sides of the wall also contain passages that are taken from the slave narratives of that project that I just mentioned, the Federal Writers Project. Even though neither of those interviewees were people who lived in the Whitney plantation. Then you see also that there are some images along the displayed on this wall, and according to the newspaper articles that were published when this was unveiled, they say that the owner, Dan Cummins, that he took inspiration from the Vietnam Memorial here in Washington, D.C. to create this. He says that it was not the case, that this is inspired from the tombstones of slave owners in Louisiana. But Louisiana indeed has these tombstones, but usually they are for each slave owner. Here we have a collective monument to all enslaved people. Then there is a second memorial that you can see. You can move to the next slide. This is then one wall of names is not sufficient. We have a second memorial that carries the same idea with the same kind of plaques, and this is called the Alice Gwendolyn Meadow Hall. Gwendolyn Meadow Hall, who is a North American historian, who created a database with the names of all people that she was able to find that worked as enslaved as slaves in Louisiana. And the database that is in digital form has more than 100,000 names. Then one of the curators of the Whitney plantation took the names, transcribed the names, and put them in memorial form. Here again, there is a sort of relation with the Ad Vashem idea, because we have the database that is digital and have a permanent form of memorial with the same names that we find in the database. Then this honors all the enslaved people of Louisiana. Then you can go to the next one, and you have then a memorial that is this picture. I am aware that isn't good. I had to take this one from the internet because I didn't have any that was that would give this entire the idea of the entire thing. But this is a memorial then with more than 2,000 names, only honoring enslaved children then who were born under slavery in Louisiana. Then here you are honoring all enslaved people in Louisiana. And you have then this kind of sculpture here that is a sculpture that's similar to the ones that we find in cemeteries. Of course, that here is the introduction of these devices is done in a way that is very original. In no other place we find, no other plantation or slave heritage site we find this kind of commemoration. And of course, by doing so, this is a gesture then of recognition to those people, men, women, and children about whom we don't even have many records. But there are problems as well, because as this is a private site, there are several elements that limit the visitors' engagement with these memorials. Then what I am saying here is that only to create wall of names is not a guarantee that this is the most efficient way to honor the victims. First of all, this is a private place. Then not everybody you can honor all Louisiana's slaves here, but not everybody can come here. It's paid. You have to pay $22 to visit the plantation. The visit is part of a sort of a ritual, because you cannot visit and spend how can I say, you are not free to spend as much time as you want engaging with each memorial. You need to follow a guide. The visit to the entire site lasts about 1.5 hours. Then visitors, they cannot go alone and stay there reading the names or searching names for how long they want. Then this is one of the limitations. But there are other things that are interesting, and this is something that you will be able to do after. Like many of those who are visiting this plantation, because it's so rich, they take pictures, they make videos, and they post on YouTube. Then they are the visit continues once people are at home, because they will post on YouTube and engage with them. It will continue to engage with these memorials even if they already left the site. And you're going to have other initiatives making use of this wall of names. Then I will just move here fast, because I'm not sure about how much time I have. I don't think I have more time at all. But you see here, and this I think that is going already to make a connection with Caro's presentation, because I saw that she has some elements on Jefferson and Hemmings. This is an exhibition that was in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. It was just a gallery, just an exhibition about Thomas Jefferson, Monticello, and the enslaved people who lived there. They used again this idea of wall of names. They took the inventory, the farm books, they create this wall, but what they put just across from the wall, they put Jefferson as the main element of this memorial. If we can move to the next one, the same idea was retaken at the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, in this big hall celebrating the new independent United States. We have again Jefferson exactly in the middle here. You see him, and then behind him there is a sort of wall of names, which are several bricks indeed, and each brick has the name of one of these enslaved, of the names of each enslaved person who lived in Monticello, his property in Virginia. We have also the last slide, which is the one showing then an exhibition that was just opened about 2 years ago here in near Washington, D.C. That this is in Mount Vernon, that was the plantation of George Washington. And this, again, we have the idea of wall of names that appears here through a sort of glass wall that is transparent. But once again, we have the names to honor the enslaved people, but then Washington is the person who is the most prominent, placed just across from the wall. Then we can say that if we move then to just to conclude very fast, then let me just emphasize that, especially then in the aftermath of the Second World War and the revelation of the horrors of the Holocaust, these memorial projects really embraced the idea of wall of names. Then writing the names of the dead on memorial walls not only recognized the humanity of millions of victims of human atrocities, but also conferred them a permanent presence among the living ones. As the commemoration of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery gained ground around the world over the last 30 years, monuments and memorials paying tribute to enslaved men, women, and children also adopted various versions of wall of names. Although we saw that the early ventures featuring this kind of device, they rather reinforce the humanization of enslaved men, women, and children by putting just those inventories in panels. Yet we can say that the proliferation of wall of names can also trivialize in many ways, this instrument as a commemoration device of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery in contexts where it remains very difficult to tell the stories of enslaved men, women, and children, the stories that are behind the names. Then, unlike other memorials, however, Whitney Plantation's tree wall of names that we saw follow a conventional design. Moreover, they do not stand alone. Not only they heavily rely on the use of visual images and narratives from enslaved people whose names are not necessarily displayed on the walls, but their impact greatly depend indeed on the tour guide's words. It depends on what the guide tells you, and not only on the relation between the spectator, the visitor, and the memorial. Also, despite Whitney Plantation's excessive use of all wall of names, visitors to the site are not given time to freely complete the tour and engage with the names. This trivialization is also visible in other U.S. initiatives examined here in this presentation, where walls of names have been used as a mere textured background that instead of honoring enslaved people, they honor indeed the founding fathers who were the slave owners, such as Washington or Thomas Jefferson. Then beyond recognition, writing and reading out loud the names of enslaved people gave them the humanity once stripped out from them in the holds of the slave ships. The establishment then of wall of names is not dissociated from the present struggles against the legacies of slavery, and this is the point that I make. The movement Black Lives Matter, for example, that emerged in the United States in 2013, largely employed the hashtag on social media that was Say Her Name. And this as an instrument to resist police violence against Black women. In a similar fashion, the names of enslaved individuals imprinted on commemorative walls reached audiences beyond museums and heritage sites. In 2016, for example, the Slave Route Challenge, it was a race covering then the city of Cape Town in South Africa. they decided to do this race, paying homage to all the enslaved people who were kept in the slave lodge that I showed you, that now is the Ezekiel Slave Lodge Museum. And they paid homage to enslaved people by giving to each runner the name of one of the enslaved. And these were 8,000 names. Also, we have new official projects memorializing slavery that also include the construction of Wall of Names. In 2018, French President Emmanuel Macron confirmed his intention not only to establish a foundation for the memory of slavery, but also to create a wall of names to commemorate the victims of slavery, and this to be placed at the Tuileries Garden in Paris. And to Macron, then, the wall of names is a way to show that there are lives, biographies, people behind this reality, these numbers. And then in the United States, the University of Virginia, just nearby where these plantations are, is also planning the construction of a memorial to the nearly 5,000 enslaved laborers who lived and worked at the university between 1817 and 1816. The approved design comprises then a circular structure similar to that perhaps that we saw at Yad Vashem, with an interior granite wall with the names of the enslaved people who worked there. Then in both cases, the inclusion of Wall of Names in France or in University of Virginia then seemed to respond then to the demands of Black social actors who evaluate that this kind of device is the most appropriate way to reinstate humanity to their ancestors. Thank you.